Hey kids, what's up? What's up? Just wanted to do something special for you all. We've not been able to have church at the church building lately due to this virus, and I know you don't understand a lot of that and whatnot, but I wanted to come up with a way that I could interact with you and us just have a good time. And Casey's going to kill me if I don't do something. She may join us here if I don't do it, but it's story time with Pastor Ryan, okay? And she's probably going to tell you he was making funny voices and stuff before. I might do it for you in person sometime, okay? But tonight, I want to read you a story. It's one that I love. It's called Sidney and Norman. I don't know if you know about Sidney and Norman, but they're two cool pigs, okay? And what we're going to learn about tonight is about a little invitation they got. And I hope that you learned something from this story. Because listen, I got this book probably about 13 years ago. And so I would have been like 23 years old, and I was buying a children's book, but it spoke to me. And moms and dads, as you listen tonight, grandparents, whoever's listening, this story is going to speak to you as well, but it's for the kids, and I hope you enjoy Sidney and Norman. In a quiet street, in a quiet town, lived two pigs. They didn't oink or eat slop. No, that isn't this kind of story. They wore suit coats and went to work, and even though they lived right next door to each other, they didn't know each other's names. The pig on the right was Norman. He was a very good pig. Rules and hard work had always come easily to him, and it showed. His house was neat and organized. He always looked his very best. He gave money to the needy, and he never missed church on Sunday. Norman's teachers liked him when he was young, and his boss at work liked him now that he was all grown up. He was pretty sure God liked him too. After all, he was a very good pig. Norman figured that everyone could be as good as he was if they'd just try a little harder. He wondered why they didn't, though. Now, the pig on the left, the pig that lived in the house next door, well, that was Sidney. And things didn't come quite as easily for Sidney. Rules and systems and schedules, they seemed, well, a bit slippery for old Sidney. One minute he thought he had them, and the next minute, well, whoops, there they go. He was forever running 10 minutes late, and he never could manage, no matter how hard he tried, to get his tie perfectly straight. Not like his neighbor, what's his name? Sidney got in trouble at school, and which frustrated his teachers. He got in trouble at work, which frustrated his boss. He knew God was watching, and figured he was pretty frustrated too. But most of all, Sidney frustrated Sidney. Why was everything so hard? Why couldn't he be more like, what's his name? Sidney felt broken, and some days that made it hard to even get out of bed. Some days, he just didn't get up at all. And since Sidney was usually late and Norman was usually early, they very seldom saw each other. Unless, that is, they happened to fetch their mail at the same time, which is exactly what happened one bright morning in October. Now, normally Sidney saw Norman, he would look down and he'd shuffle back inside. He was sure Norman was staring at his tie or his hair or the papers that were half stuck into his briefcase. He was sure Norman was looking down on him for being messy, which for the most part was absolutely correct. But this day, Norman didn't look at Sidney's tie, and Sidney didn't look away because they were both staring at what they got in the mail. A small, pale blue envelope. One was addressed to Norman, and the other to Sidney. Had someone invited them to the same party? Eager to unravel the mystery, the two pigs opened their envelopes. Norman read, "Dear Norman," and Sidney read, "Dear Sidney," followed by, "I would like for you to come visit me at 77 Elm Street next Tuesday at your convenience. I have something to tell you." They both glanced at the bottom of the page and read, "Sincerely, God." Sidney and Norman reread the invitation several times to make sure they had read them correctly. God wanted to talk to them? On Tuesday? On Elm Street? Sidney panicked. Deep in his heart was a familiar feeling. The feeling he had when, as a young pig, his teacher had sent him to the principal's office. He felt terror, panic, doom. But Norman smiled. He felt a familiar feeling too. The feeling he had when, as a young pig, he was called up in front of the school to receive an award. Anticipation, happiness, and pride. Sidney taped the invitation to the inside of his front door so he wouldn't lose it. Norman, though, he entered the date neatly into his date book, and both pigs had trouble sleeping that night for very different reasons. Tuesday came. Norman awoke early, dressed, and headed down the street with the pale blue envelope firmly in his hand. Just waking up, Sidney saw him pass by the window, and he rushed for a shower. Norman walked tall and proud. Others on the street noticed he looked a bit taller and more than a little puffier than usual that morning. His hair was neat and the tie extraordinarily straight, much straighter than anyone else's on the street. God would certainly be pleased. Norman found the address and went inside and greeted the lady at the front desk with his important voice. She directed him down a long hall, through a heavy wooden door, and into a large room where he found God sitting behind a huge desk. The sight made Norman nervous, but then he thought, what'd he have to be nervous about? He was a good pig. God walked around the desk and smiled at the puffed up pig. "I'm glad you could make it," he said warmly. "I have a few things to tell you." "First of all," God began, "I love you." Norman smiled. He wasn't surprised. "Secondly, your goodness is not the reason I love you." Norman was startled a little. And what a curious thing for God to say. "Thirdly," God continued, "you're not as good as you have led others to believe. You're prideful. You're selfish. You look down on others simply because things don't come as easily for them." God looked a little sad now. "I love them just as much as I love you. Don't look down on those I love." God smiled and returned to his desk. "That's all I needed to tell you." Norman swallowed hard. That was the award? That was the commendation? Confused, he turned and ran down the hall, past the front desk, and back out on the street. His head was spinning. He felt dizzy. Was God finding fault in him? He was a good pig. He noticed his tie was a little off kilter, and he hurried to straighten it. It wasn't perfect, but at least it was better than the fellow over there in the yellow jacket, or the guy in the blue, or any of these people, for that matter. Then it hit him. He was looking down on people. Right then, right there, just like God had said. And he'd done it yesterday and the day before, 20 times a day at least. Norman's face grew hot. God was right. He was selfish. He was prideful. And for the first time in his life, the good pig had to face the fact that he had been very, very bad. His pride and his goodness was his sin. He buried his face in his hands and he hurried home, tears splashing on his neat gray suit. And from his window, Sidney saw his neighbor return and froze in shock. Was he crying? Sidney couldn't breathe. Oh dear, if that's what a visit with God did to that guy, oh, I'm doomed. Hands shaking, Sidney tried one more time to get his tie to lie just right. Why is it so hard? Now where's my hat? It's not on the hook. Of course, it's under the couch. With his hat in his hand, he peeled the pale blue envelope off the door and he stepped outside. A bird was singing that morning, but Sidney didn't hear it. The sun was shining brightly, but Sidney didn't see it. Doomed, he thought, I'm doomed. Sidney trudged down the sidewalk and suddenly was back in school. A little pig headed down the long hall toward the principal's office. Hands sweating, heart racing, doomed. He'll see right through me, Sidney thought as he turned onto Elm Street. My messes, my mistakes, everything. And then he was there. Though he'd walked as slowly as he could, he was there. Sidney stepped inside. He tried to say something to the woman at the front desk, but he couldn't speak. She smiled and motioned for him to go to the heavy wooden door down the hall. He gulped. A few moments later, he stood before the door. He wanted to run away. He wanted to hide, but there was no place to go and nothing to hide behind. So with his hat in his hand, he pushed open the door and slipped inside. And there, behind the desk, was God. Sidney gulped again. "I'm glad you could come," God said. Sidney tried to respond, but he couldn't make a noise. "I wanted to tell you something," God continued as he came around the desk. Sidney glanced around nervously. Maybe if he apologized. "First of all," God began, "I love you." Sidney startled. He was surprised. Secondly, God continued in even a quieter voice. "I love you." Sidney was gripping his hat a little less tightly now. And thirdly, God paused very close to Sidney. "I love you." The look in God's eyes warmed Sidney right down to his toes. "That's what I wanted to tell you," God said as he stepped back toward his desk, still smiling. Sidney stood frozen for a moment, then realized God had finished. He turned and he ran quickly from the room. "I don't understand," he said aloud when he reached the street. "Didn't he see me? Didn't he see who I am?" It didn't make sense. Then it occurred to Sidney. I did it. I fooled him. Sidney looked at the others on the street smiling. Yes, that must be it. I looked good when it was most important, and God bought it. But then Sidney caught his reflection in a store window. His hair was rumpled, his tie was off kilter as usual, and it was sporting a large toothpaste stain. His smile vanished. That couldn't be it. He couldn't have fooled anybody, especially God, looking like that. Sidney was confused. There was only one other possibility. Maybe God just loved him, exactly like he was, messes and all. Sidney felt the warmth he had seen in God's eyes welling up inside him again. Others on the street would later talk about the small, messy pig that day that appeared to be, well, glowing. All the way home, Sidney looked for words to tell everyone what he was feeling, but all he found were tears, happy tears, lots of them. The next day, the two pigs emerged from their homes on a bright, crisp October morning and looked at each other. The pig on the left, named Sidney, who seemed a bit taller than before, looked at his neighbor's neat straight tie and clean clothes and smiled. The pig on the right, named Norman, who seemed ever so slightly less puffy, looked at his neighbor's crooked tie and rumpled hair and smiled. It was a real smile, too. The kind that comes from deep inside. The kind he hadn't smiled in a long, long time. Sidney and Norman became good friends. There are still mornings now and then when Norman wakes up feeling a little bit puffy, but all he has to do is remember what he learned at 77 Elm Street. Then the puffiness quickly vanishes and his real smile returns. As for Sidney, he still had his share of messes, though not as many before, and there were still a few days when he wasn't quite sure he could get up in the morning. But if you stood outside his window on one of those days, this is what you'd hear. First of all, he loves me. Secondly, he loves me. And thirdly, he loves me. And that was all it took. You see, kids, God loves you. He loves you mess and all. He loves you no matter what you've done or what you're going to do in the future. So there's no reason for any of us to be puffed up like Norman. We all need to be Sidney. We need to be like Sidney, and we need to realize that God loves us no matter what we've done. I hope you enjoyed tonight's story, Sidney and Norman. We'll have another story on Monday night at 8 o'clock. See you then.